Thank you for coming. And thank you to the Bay Area Book Fest for putting such a great event on. And thank you to all of our sponsors as well. My name is Alex Green. I'm the moderator of this event. And what I thought we would do is we're gonna be passing the mic for the next hour and a half or so, or longer if you want to stay. So what I want to do is I want to have, just so you know who the authors are, and you're familiar a bit with their work, I'm going to just have them introduce themselves and their latest book, and maybe just give a quick, couple of sentence word synopsis of what the book is about. So here we go.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jason Reynolds, and my latest book is As Brave as You, which came out a few weeks ago. It's middle grade, my first middle grade foray, and I'm super excited about it. And it's just about, I'll talk about the book a little bit. It's just about two young men in Brooklyn, New York, two young brothers, 11 and 13, who decide, or who are sent rather down south, right? So they're city kids who are sent to the south to spend a month with their grandparents. Their grandfather, though, is blind, which the youngest boy who is telling the story does not know until he gets there. And of course, therein lies the rub. Dun, dun, dun. And from there, we get the story.
Hey there, my name is Tim Federle. I'm originally from Foster City, actually, California, down on the peninsula. And no reaction, and just nobody. And is this song? And I live in New York now. My latest book is called The Great American Whatever. It's my first YA novel. It's about a 16-year-old filmmaker whose life is hit with an unexpected tragedy, and it's about 1 week in the course of his life as he sort of crawls out of this hole and sort of rediscovers who he is. I previously wrote some middle grade novels, including Better Nate Than Ever, which is this very autobiographical book about a kid who runs away from home to crash a audition for E.T. the musical. My first career was I was a Broadway dancer in things like The Little Mermaid. And then I also write cocktail books, like Tequila Mockingbird is probably my best known literary cocktail book. So it's great to be here today.
My name is Luen Yang. I'm a cartoonist. I make comic books and graphic novels. My most recent book is called Secret Coders. It's actually a 6-volume middle grade reader in graphic novel format. The first volume is already out. The second one will be out in August of this year. And this is a series that I've been thinking about for a really long time. So before I became a full-time cartoonist, I was a high school computer science teacher, and I taught in this really visual way, where I do a lot of drawing on the board. And I always thought a lot of these lessons would work well in graphic novel format. So the Secret Coders is a graphic novel series that teaches kids the foundational concepts of computer programming. I'm doing it with this guy named Mike Holmes, who's an amazing, amazing illustrator. Before working with me on Secret Coders, he used to do Adventure Time. He used to do the Adventure Time comics. And the way we're talking about it is we're telling people that it's a little bit like Harry Potter. So you know how Harry Potter goes? There's a group of kids that find the secret school. The secret school teaches magic and they become wizards. Our book is almost like that. There's a group of kids that find the secret school. The secret school, instead of teaching magic, teaches coding, and they become coders. If you've read Harry Potter, you know there's a problem with that book. It's an awesome book series, but there is a problem. The problem is you read about these kids becoming wizards, and when you go home and you try those same things, you don't get to be a wizard. Our book does not have that problem. In our book, you read about these kids becoming coders, you go home and you try those same things, you also get to be a coder.
Yay, that's awesome.
And Gene's the ambassador.
Yeah.
Lead with you being the ambassador.
I will be using that line in bars a lot. Tom Waits has a really great line where he says, just because your line isn't in the water doesn't mean you're not thinking about fishing. And I'm wondering about the gestation period of the books you guys have just written. How long were you carrying around the idea before you actually broke ground on it?
Oh, man. Probably like 6 years for me, that particular book, just because I come from this like really strange and colorful family, and where everybody's a sort of a storyteller, right? And everyone's got such interesting stories to tell, and everyone thinks they're the best, so they want you to listen to this thing they want you to know about, and it's usually about our family. And so my father's father was blind, my grandfather, and he'd never seen me. And my father would always tell me stories about all the things that my grandfather used to do and could do. And so to me, my grandfather was always sort of this superhero who had I always tell people my grandfather was like a mutant, right? He could have been like an X-Man because he could do things that everyone said a blind person wasn't supposed to be able to do. So he cooked his own food, and he lived alone for 25 years. He cleaned his own house, picked out his own clothes. He could count his own money, right? Because he had hypersensitivity in his fingers, right? So he could touch the old dollar bills. With the chlorophyll paper dollar bills, the numbers were raised just enough for nobody in this room could have ever known, right? But he could feel it. He could feel the 5 and feel the 1 and feel the 20, right? And so all of these things are things that I've been thinking about and was sort of stewing with for a long, long time, trying to figure out how to put it into some kind of crazy book about some teenagers. And mainly because I was such a city boy and I was such a there's something weird about the South, right? No offense to the Southern people in the room. But for me as a city kid, it was like, they know things that I don't know. At least as I got older. When I was younger, it was like, I know everything and they know nothing. And then you start interacting, you're like, oh man, like I eat food every day, but I don't know where it comes from, right? Oh, we call people to do everything in our house, to fix everything. Whereas I go down south and they're like, we're going to get under the house and fix all the pipes. We're going to build this house with our hands. We're going to, right? These sort of things that this cultural exchange. And so I sat with all of those things for 6-7 years before actually putting a word on the page.
Yeah, that feels like sort of a cousin of the question, how long did it take you to write this book, which I'm sure we all get a lot. I tend to write first drafts very quickly, so most of my novels, like I pump it out in like a month or a month and a half every day, like a chapter a day. But then there's a long editing process. But really, to answer the question of how long, like for Great American Whatever, it's inspired in a way by an accident outside my high school in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where we moved when I was a kid. And there was a girl in my school who got killed in a car accident, and that was sort of like a wake up day for me in realizing that mortality was gonna greet us all. It wasn't just sort of my elderly grandparents who would die. And so in a way, I was carrying around this book for 20 years, kind of. And so I think as an author, the Tom Waits line, I think as an author, you're always sort of thinking about how things that affect you in your own life can affect your own work. And I'll also say I think the great advantage of being a writer as opposed to a not writer is that the setbacks of your own life, particularly if you write autobiographically, and in many cases I think the three of us do, those setbacks in your life can become the most interesting story points later in your novels, because without conflict there's no story. And so, for instance, in Better Nate Than Ever, he is really picked on at the audition, and the audition doesn't go well for him. And those things happened to me when I used to take the bus from Pittsburgh to New York. It'd be a 10-hour bus ride, and then I'd go audition for Radio City, and then I'd get cut, and then I'd go back to Pittsburgh. And it felt like it meant nothing as a kid, but then it became a story. So the stories gestate in very different ways.
I totally agree with Tim. I think I definitely think that as you're living your life, you're just kind of collecting data, right? You're collecting things that you can use, you're researching stuff that you can use as material for future stories. For Secret Coders in particular, like I said, I've been thinking about it for a long time, ever since I started teaching computer science. Each of the characters, the main characters in my book, is inspired by somebody real. So I guess in some ways, they started as soon as I met or read about this real person. So my main character, her name is Hopper. She's inspired by one of the most influential coders in the history of coding, a woman by the name of Grace Murray Hopper. You all know who this is? You should know who this is. This is a really important lady. What a lot of people don't realize is that coding as a discipline started as what was considered a woman's profession. A lot of, the very first coder in the world was a woman. Her name was Ada Lovelace. Early on, most of the coders were women, and this wasn't for good reasons. This is because back in the day, when people looked at computers, they thought the hardware was the important part, so the men got to work on that. And then the software, the code, was not quite as important, so that was left to the women. But what that resulted in was that a lot of what we think of as the discipline of coding was created on ideas that were had by women. So, I probably learned that in college. So I would say that Hopper as a character has kind of lived in my brain since college. The main antagonist of the first book is a guy named Josh, who's kind of mean. He's kind of a jerk. And he's actually based on a real life jerk that I know. My brother-in-law, Louis. who's actually, like, we're kind of friends, but he loves to make fun of me. So I wanted to do a character who's kind of a jerk who was based on him. And out of all the Asian people I know, Louis also has the most pointy nose. Like, I've never seen another Asian person with such a pointy nose. And that's why Josh also is a Asian character with a super pointy nose.
It's hilarious.
You should find that guy on Facebook. I just can't believe you'd say that with your wife in the room. Oh, okay. There comes a moment, and I've heard Louis C.K. was talking about this in an interview recently, where he was saying that you can have an amazing idea for something. In his case, it's a script, and for you guys, for a new novel, and you get really excited about it, and then you start writing, and you have to find out, in his words, does it right? And there has to come a moment, he was saying, where maybe you get 50 pages in, maybe you get 60 pages in, and it's not working. And you have to have that difficult it's like a breakup conversation. Like, this isn't working. We have to talk about seeing other book ideas. Have you guys, has that problem happened? And when it does, what do you do? At what point do you turn back and say, we need to do, this has to be something else? Or has that not even happened?
It's happened. Has it happened to you?
Yes, it's happened to me.
I don't know, man. It's happened. It's happened. It's happened a lot. But I also am just not. I think that the one thing as a writer, especially a writer on the professional end, you learn very quickly not to be precious, because even if it's something that you love and that did right, when your editor sees it, she's going to slaughter it, right? And so you just learn early on that not everything that you put on the page is meant for the eyes of the public, and not everything that you put on the page is going to work. John Corey Whaley has this whole thing about, you guys know John Corey Whaley, some of you. So he wrote Where Things Come Back, and he wrote Noggin and his new book. But he has this whole thing about how when he wrote Where Things Come Back, it won all these awards. His second book, he was like, I'm going to win another award. And he wrote this whole novel twice, and it was terrible. And no one ever saw it, and then he wrote Noggin after that, right? But this sort of constant, like, you don't, like Tim, I don't outline anything, so I'm starting at A. I know what Z is going to be, I know what A is going to be, and then I sort of let the story meander for a bit until I kind of find my legs. In that process, though, there are moments where you're like, it's never going to find its legs, right? And so we're just going to go ahead and crush it, or we're just going to change Z, or maybe we'll change A. Right, and give it another go, or maybe we'll add a character. Right, there are things you can do to sort of keep the adventure up and to sort of answer some of the questions and solve some of the problems before the final. Like, we may need to see other books. Right, there are a lot of other steps in between that, I think, for me at least, of me trying to figure out how to troubleshoot it. But it happens. I mean, look, everybody thinks they're a genius, right? And then it's so crazy. And being a writer means that you're awfully self-centered. Like, most of us are, because you have to be, right? Like, we spend so much time alone. And so if you have any bit of success, and even people who haven't, you're like, yo, I've got the idea for the next great American, right? Like, the next great American novel. And most of the time, it's just not true. Most of the time, it's just not the case.
We'll break it up. You go.
You guys both don't outline?
No.
You just make it up as you go?
No.
That makes me so mad. I read have you read their books? Their books are like so well structured. How do you do that then? How do you figure out the story structure if you're not outlining?
As you go. And sometimes also I think you're such an ambassador. You passed it back. Dad. Oftentimes you only know the story when you get to the end. So even if you outline something, I also write like screenplays, and I just wrote a musical, and in that case, especially when you've got tons of people waiting on you, or like I had a movie I was working on with Nickelodeon, and they needed to see every, and I get this, but they had to approve every outline stage and then every draft, and whereas with a novel, it's frequently like, dear editor, I know we haven't talked in a year, here's the book I owed you 7 months ago, and it's attached as a Word doc, and it's the first time he's seeing it. So frequently I think it's about going back and going, oh, this is the story I actually wanted to tell, which we have probably the advantage of writing in, I heard Jason say this in the last session, what is it, prose? free verse. Yeah, like blank verse prose. Whereas you have to plot out every frame, right, as a graphic novelist. So I imagine it's so time intensive at every step.
Well, there are cartoonists who do it your way, who like kind of when they're drawing one page, they're not totally sure what happens on the next page. And there are also comic book writers who, as they're writing the comic book script, they're making it up as they go. But I've always been in awe of people who, I mean, I would say like probably most of my writer friends are like you guys, like they can kind of make it up as they go along, and you still find this underlying structure underneath. So I can't do that. And to answer the original question, what I do is I'll do these story outlines, and I'll pass them to my editor, I'll pass them to some of my friends, I'll do revisions on them, and sometimes those story outlines never go anywhere. They just are terrible, and they just stay on my computer. And then other times, if it feels solid, if I get an okay from friends who I trust and from my editor, then this is an awkward analogy to make because my wife is in the room, but I think of it like a marriage, right? Like the outline, when I'm working on the outline, that's kind of like dating and maybe engagement, you know? And once that outline is solidified, that's like I got a ring on my finger. So either like me and this story are not gonna part ways until one of us is finished. Either I die or that book is finished, right? That's just the way it goes. No matter how I feel about it in the middle, we're just gonna stick with it until it's done.
You know, and I also want to say, because I imagine there's aspiring, non-published, but someday published authors in the room with us today. There's at least one of you I know, probably 20. And I just want to say that, like, for me, The Great American Whatever started as an unpublished novel that I wrote on spec, like, for myself 6 years ago, that got me an agent, but she said to me, I can't sell this book. This should not be your first book. And all these years later, I went back to it. So don't think that your work is ever for naught. There may be a thread in it. In fact, I heard Stephen Chbosky once say that he was 70 pages into a novel once when he wrote the line, "The perks of being a wall." Well, that's just one of the perks of being a wallflower. And he was like, whoa, that's the book I want to write. So he started over with that new title, and just know that as a writer, you'll come back to stuff in ways that you don't expect later, and it's not a waste.
And also, just sorry, this is one of those questions. And also, just to answer your question about sort of like, how does that happen? I think for me, I don't necessarily, an outline for me would be pretty drab, because I don't. What would be beneficial to me is not an outline, but a character sketch, because I put most of my energy into creating characters more than I do in creating plot and creating plot line, right? Like for me, my books are all about, like, do you care enough about this character to sit with him on the stoop for 300 pages? Do you care enough about this character to he's in the hospital bed the entire time? Are you okay with that, right? Can I create a character that you are engaged with enough where nothing really has to happen for you to continue to read the book? Because I believe that humans connect with humans, right? Like humanity is all about the relationship between human and human more than anything else, right? And I always pick like Tupac as a kid, right? Tupac could have said, I'm selling candles, and I would have said, yo, Mom, we got to go to the mall because Tupac got candles on sale, and I need Tupac candles, not because they were going to smell good or burn any differently, but because he said they belong to him, because I believe in him. So I'll do anything he says to do, right? I just try to create little Tupacs in every single book that kids and adults are like, yo, I don't care what happens in this story. I'm riding this out because I love this kid. And that allows me the freedom to kind of meander, for me.
There's I'm a music journalist, so forgive the music references. But, and here comes a Van Halen one. But Eddie Van Halen said that you have your entire life to write your first album, and you have a year to write your second. And I think that explains, in a lot of ways in music, what the sophomore slump is, that a lot of people can't handle the fact that they had so much acres of time. They carried around their first album for 21, 25, 30 years. And then when it comes time for the second one, it's really hard to execute it because I'm not really used to working in that kind of way. Have you guys felt that there is a certain amount of pressure to produce? And if so, did you find the first novel to be the easier one to write because of that time crunch?
Well, first, I'd like to say that I think Eddie Van Halen's quote works for music more than it does for literature. And the reason why is because I don't know any authors that I can think of offhand that I know whose first novel published was their first novel written. Right? So like the first novel written, none of you have ever seen. Right, like, and I think that's sort of the one caveat in that statement. So by the time that there's a published novel, trust and believe that that's usually not the first one, and that's usually the second or third or fourth novel that we've produced at that point. And the reason why it happens that way for us, I think, is because I think that there's a bit of a learning curve. No matter how educated you are as a writer, there's a learning curve on how to create narrative and how to construct a story and how to construct a book and what works, right? What works for you? What's your voice? What's your style? What's your way of doing this thing in this particular form? And you're changing rather rapidly, and you're actively reading books. Most of us are, at least, in which you're stealing things, right? And because reading is much more of an activity, right? More of an active process than listening to music is, which is a bit more passive, right? Like an active process, I think you're engaged with literature differently, which changes the way you're writing. All these sort of things are happening to you by the time your first book actually hits the shelf. Now, in terms of whether or not I feel any bit of a bit of pressure, yeah, I always feel pressure though, but that's a pressure that's self-imposed, right? I did not get into the business of storytelling to be mediocre. And I feel like we are gonna share this. I mean, if you guys know Gene and have seen any of his work, or have seen him give a lecture, this isn't. I mean, if I'm gonna do it, I want to be good at it, and I want to be better at it. I want to constantly be growing in it and working at it. I'm not interested in sort of being mediocre. I'm not interested in sort of being swept up. My job is to do the best I can do every single time. So the pressure is a self-imposed pressure. Now, is there pressure from the outside in terms of if you have any success and you're afraid that success won't be there the next time? Of course, I'm human, right? Like, it's a human thing. You want people to like what you make, but most of it's coming from me. Most of it's coming from sort of me wanting to be great, and it doesn't necessarily get easier. Right? I think people are like, yo, once you write your first book, man, you'll be good. And I think writing a book is like climbing Mount Everest, right? It's like you climb Mount Everest and you get to the top of the mountain and you're like, yo, I climbed Mount Everest, right? And then you're like, man, on the way down the whole time, you're like, yo, I can't believe I actually climbed Mount Everest. And then you get to the bottom and you're like, yo, I'm so happy that now that I've climbed Mount Everest, I know I can climb it again, never realizing that all the footholds have shifted. Right, and now it's a new journey every time, So you know what I mean. So it's different. It's hard every time, but the pressure is all on me.
I definitely felt pressure. I agree with Jason. I think American Born Chinese was the first book that got published by my current publisher, First Second Books, but it wasn't the first comic that I produced. But I did feel pressure after that book came out. I just remember feeling really freaked out all the time. And I was really freaked out. Like the next book that I did was called Level Up. It was a joint project between me and a friend named Tin Pham, and I think that helped a lot. The fact that the book that I did after American Born Chinese was something between me and my friend. So if it failed, I could blame it on him, right? No, but that's not why. It's also because it was just nice to have a partner on that. And what happened was Tin and I, we worked on Level Up for about a year and a half or 2 years. We wrote the whole thing. Then we illustrated everything up until the last 3 pages. And we get this call from our editor, and he goes, this book is just not working. You're gonna have to read, we can't publish it. I'm sorry. And what Tin and I ended up doing was we just started over from page 1. And that book ended up taking us 4 years to finish from beginning to end. I have to tell you, my editor was right. But that was my second book. It was the unpublished version of Level Up. And I think the function that had for me was it let me, I think there was something really, really comforting about failing. After I had a success, there was something just, it was like a nice warm blanket to fail.
I want to talk about some thematic things before we transition into talking about Reading Without Walls. But thematically, do you guys find that no matter how different the story is that you're writing, that you're drawn to the same themes, that you're almost trying to reckon with the same things over and over again, even though you can totally frame it in an entirely different narrative? Do you find yourself returning to the same stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think I usually start with kind of like a lot, like the elevator pitch to myself of what the book's going to be, so that I sort of know what I'm writing to. So for Better Nate Than Ever, the idea is that it's about this kid who crashes an audition for E.T. the musical. The theme I was working with was, what if you don't have to change anything about yourself, but you just need to be in another place for it to work? So for me, it was the difference between like living in Pittsburgh as like the one theater kid. You can read what that means. In my group at school, and then going to New York, where I always say like everything that got me picked on in middle school gets me paid now. So I just sort of like moved it to New York, and it worked. And suddenly I was applauded for being like a loudmouth and a class clown. For the second Nate book, the theme I was writing to is like, what happens if you get what you want and it still isn't what you thought it would be? So Nate gets cast in E.T. the musical, but then even in the Broadway journey, there were things that were disappointing to him. So thematically, I think I'm interested in sort of like underdogs, and also people who try to take setbacks and turn it into sort of like a punchline and like find the lighter side in life. Yeah, I would say that thematically is what I work with. How about you guys?
Do you feel like you returned to that consciously, though?
Did I return to it consciously?
Or is it just
Yeah.
something that happens?
I think that one just happens sort of naturally. This is a slightly different answer, but we were talking in the last panel, like, I write cocktail books in middle grade and YA and different genres, but I specifically chose to use my name for all of them as opposed to changing my name or like writing under a pen name, because ultimately I just want to try to like entertain with a heart is sort of like what I attempt in my work. And so it felt like I'm going to do that hopefully no matter who I write for, as opposed to trying to put on different hats and it's sort of somehow fake who I am. Gene, anything theme? Gene on theme.
I think for me it kind of emerges naturally. I have this friend named Marsha Qualley, who's also a YA author. We both teach at Hamlin University through their low-res creative writing program. If any of you are interested in studying creative writing with a bunch of novelists and poets and graphic novelists, you should check out Hamlin University. It's amazing. Anyways, she says that at the heart of every YA novel is this equation, and that equation is power plus belonging is equal to identity. And I don't know if it's true for every single YA novel, but it's definitely true for all of mine. I think I constantly return to these themes of power and belonging, how characters find their power, how they find their place in the world, and how that adds up to how they see themselves.
I once heard Cheryl Strayed, the writer who wrote Wild and Tiny Beautiful Things. She said that you only know at the end of the story. The stories are always, what's the story about and what happens in the story. So one thing is like plot, and then the other is theme in a way. And I think you only know the theme at the end, frequently for many of us. At the end, you go, oh, that's what I meant to say. Even if you have plotted out beforehand, sort of he goes from A to B to C.
I think for me, it's. I think one of the things that always sort of come back that shows that one of the things that show themselves in my books all the time is this. There's like an obsession with humanity, right? Like giving young people humanity. Specifically the young people that I'm writing about, which are typically kids of color, growing up in specific neighborhoods that I grew up in, the neighborhoods that many of people are afraid of, right? This whole, and taking them outside of the sliver of the soundbite and in the YouTube video and Facebook posts and news clips and rap songs and showing you who they really are. I think that I grew up a kid who was, I was the kid who walked in. I mean, look, even to this day, you walk in certain rooms and everyone thinks they know who I am because of the way that I look. And so for me, it's really important, no matter what the story is actually about, just to say that there are kids growing up in neighborhoods. There are kids growing up in Oakland. There are kids growing up in South Central and in Compton who are kids, right? Who just want the same things that you want, and they shouldn't have to feel ashamed of who they are, where they come from, and you shouldn't have to be afraid that you don't know anything about where they are and where they come from. And that these books can sort of serve as just a reminder that that we are no different than whoever that they are. And I think it always comes up. And I don't, probably because I felt, somebody told me one time, yo man, you should have wrote, when Noggin came out, somebody was like, yo, you should write a novel like that, right? Where a kid has his head chopped off, right? Or you should write a novel, a sci-fi joint where like some kids are like out in space, right? They're from Brooklyn and then they go to space, right? And my honest response, as sort of harsh as it seemed at the time, it was honest. And my honest response is, I'm still trying to convince the world that we exist. There are so many of us who are still fighting to convince everybody that we are people, let alone putting us in space. You won't even come to my neighborhood, but you want to put me in space, right? You want me to chop my head off so everyone can say, ain't no way a little black kid was going to have his head chopped off and put back on it, right? Because that's what would happen. Would the story change? And the truth is that given the cultural context, one that we cannot escape no matter how much we want to in this country as of today, we're getting there, right? As of today, that always is sort of showing itself. Like, how can I just say that the little kids that y'all call thugs aren't, that they're human, that they're kids, they're teenagers? That the kids y'all see in Baltimore fighting on the news are angry, are frustrated, not hooligans, right? And I think that's sort of what always, and I don't care if it always shows up in my books, honestly. It's something that I take super personal because it's who I am, you know, so.
One of the things that I always say when I interview bands that made a huge impact on me, I've been lucky enough to talk to some of these people, and I keep telling myself not to say it, but I can't help but say it. It just comes out. Is I'll say, "You got me through high school," you know, or "You saved my life," and I actually mean it. I'm curious to know what kinds of responses you've gotten from those kids that you're talking about, that you're writing for, that have kind of blown your mind. Because when you get that kind of response, you're not really expecting it, and it can really be affecting. I'm just curious to know what kinds of reactions you guys have gotten to your work that you found particularly moving. Man. That's a long list, right?
Not even that, but you know what? We'll leave the ambassador for last. I think because I'm fascinated to know. But I would say this recently. I would say recent. So recently, as in like last week, there's this kid. I think he's in the Midwest. His name is Ernie, and Ernie is graduating or just graduated from the 8th grade, and he read All American Boys, and he loves this book. Now Ernie is coming from a really, really tough background. He's doing terribly in school. He's got social workers. He's got IEPs, the whole thing, right? He's having a tough time. His librarian reached out to my publisher and was like, "Look, this kid, for some reason, this book is like this is his thing, and he carries it around. I know I'm not going to get it back at the end of the year. It's fine, right?" You know, like, that's okay. You know, and she said, "Can you please reach out to Jason to let him know that can he send anything to this kid?" So we packaged up all the books, wrote him little letters, and we sent them out to this young man, Ernie. Ernie graduated on Friday, and at his graduation, he was the only kid who wasn't given any awards. And so as the teacher is like, "Look, and for this award and that award, and all the kids with citizenship awards, all the kids with honor roll and presidential awards and all the things," and Ernie isn't getting any award, and Ernie's parents aren't even there for that matter. Like, Ernie is in a bad place. And at the end of it, the teacher says, "And now the final award is for Ernie." And she brings up this box that I mailed him, and he opens this box, and it's these books it's my books, and Ernie has his sort of moment in the sun, and all the kids gather around, and now suddenly Ernie's the guy, right? And that's like, I wept like a baby when she sent me the email, like, this is what happened. Like, we gave these to Ernie at the graduation as a way not to praise or chastise, not to praise Ernie for not doing better in school or to chastise him for things that were out of his control, but to just say that we see you. That's it. We see you too, Ernie, right? And that's incredible.
Ooh, that's a good story. Well, now I'll go. That's amazing. No, it's such a privilege to write for young people. It really is. I get a lot of emails from like moms who say, you know, my son is the only boy in his ballet school in Utah, and his librarian gave him better Nate than ever, and thank you. And those are very touching. But something happened a couple years ago, which is right when Better Nate Than Ever was going to come out, my publisher Simon & Schuster, also Jason's, had arranged this sort of this tour for me. And I was going to go back and launch my book at my hometown school. And these things take a crazy amount of coordination between books being sent and teachers signing off and the kids being messaged with slips and forms. And I was so prepped for it. And a week before going to this visit, they canceled. And they canceled the visit because ostensibly the school board had found out that there's like a gay character in the book. And it's a book for middle schoolers, and there's like nothing explicit, there's nothing graphic. It's just that he is starting on the pages of the book to sort of notice other boys and go like, huh, but he's really more into like mac and cheese, like that. He's 13. And that really sucked. It like really sucked that they canceled that visit. And then something funny happened, which was 3 years later, after the book had done very well and sort of won awards and it was really out there, and I had had these other books. My school, the same school district that canceled on me, wrote me an email and said, we want to induct you into the Hall of Fame now. And I kind of went, oh, that's a different tune. And so instead of going back to accept the award, I know there's this drama kid at my school. He's like my Ernie. He's this kid Zach from my former from my alma mater, and he's a theater kid who had written to me and was crazy about Better Nate Than Ever and performed a monologue that he sent me on YouTube. And so I sent Zach up to the podium to accept for me, and I had him give this speech to the teachers at my school in Pittsburgh, which was basically to any teacher out there who thinks that you should be encouraging the students to peak now, tell them to peak later. Like, get your students to know that their lives, if they're lucky, are going to be really long, and that you want them to actually blossom later. Because if you've figured out the entire social order by the time you're 13, then you've learned a lot of really terrible society lessons about popularity and looks. And so I had Zach give that speech, and I think the teachers were sort of like, why did we induct him into the Hall of Fame? And so that's, so in terms of like tying back to reader response, it becomes a dialogue between us and our readers. Not always literally, I don't always like tweet back at people, but it's the idea that the amazing thing about writing books for young people is that they discover them on their library shelves years after you wrote them, and that's the most, extraordinary privilege of all.
I seem to, like for American-born Chinese, I do hear from a lot of children of immigrants, and it seems like regardless of where your parents are from, if you if your family came to the United States and you grew up in like this dual reality where you spoke one language at home and another one at school, where you went by one name at home and another one at school, where you lived under two different sets of cultural expectations, it seemed like those sorts of people connect well with American-born Chinese. When people talk to me about like a specific part of the book that connected, I'm always surprised. This one panel comes up over and over again. There's this one scene that I have in the book where Jin Wang is this Chinese-American boy, and he's sitting in class, and then he's like the only Asian kid in the whole class, and then a new kid comes in named Wei Chen, and he's introduced to the class by the teacher, and then when that happens, Jin thinks to himself, he thinks, something inside me wants me to beat that kid up. And so many people have of a variety of ethnic backgrounds have told me they can relate to that particular sentiment. Which is, I don't know, I just feel like it's just kind of like, it makes me grateful, but I also feel kind of sad about humanity in general, right? About that. Like that I felt that, and that I wasn't the only one that felt that. It was both. More recently, so that reaction, I think, makes me feel deeply grateful for being able to tell stories. More recently, I had a mom send me this photo of her first grade daughter, her daughter in first grade, and she had just read Secret Coders Volume 1. In Volume 1, I teach you how to read binary, and she told me that her daughter got so excited that she could read binary that she actually taught her class how to read binary the next day. So she sent me this photo of this little girl at the chalkboard teaching a bunch of first graders to read binary. I thought it was awesome.
You're teaching people how to code.
Gene, we've been talking about the ambassadorship here. We've been kind of alluding to it. I wonder if you could talk a bit about Reading Without Walls, just so people are clear with what that is and what it's all about.
So this crazy thing happened to me this past January. I got invited to Washington, D.C. by the Library of Congress, and they had the super fancy ceremony for me. They gave me this fancy medal. I had to wear this fancy suit, and they named me the National Ambassador for Young People's Literature, which is, out of all of my job titles that I've ever had in my entire life, that one has the most syllables. It's been a ton of fun. It's been crazy. And the National Ambassador Program isn't that old. It got started in 2008. Every ambassador has a 2-year term, and the whole point of it is to promote reading. We're trying to get both more kids to read and kids to read more. Every ambassador picks a platform. The platform that I chose is called Reading Without Walls, and what I mean by that is I want kids to read outside of their comfort zones, to explore the world through reading. And I want them to do it in 3 specific ways. Number 1 is I want them to choose books that have main characters that don't look like them or live like them. Number 2 is I want them to pick books about topics that they might not know anything about or they might find intimidating. And 3 is I want them to pick books that are in a variety of different formats, especially formats that they don't normally read for fun. So if a kid only reads chapter books, I want them to try graphic novels. And if a kid only reads graphic novels, then I want them to try a chapter book or a book in verse. We have recommendation lists that I put out with my publisher. Books by these 2 gentlemen are on those lists, and I'm hoping that my goal is just to get kids to read diversely in every sense of the word diverse.
I'm curious to know also. I mean, when I was a kid, I moved schools, and I didn't know anybody. It was a very awkward time. And so I went to the librarian because I was a big reader, and I thought this is the safest place for me. And the librarian was a very dark-hearted, bitter person. And I said, I'm very lonely. I can't believe I even said that. I said, I'm really lonely. I have no friends, and I'm very sad. Do you have a book that would be good for me? And he gave me Death in Venice. And I said, I'm 9. And I had Death in Venice. And I tried to read it, and I realized that he was insane. That wasn't a book for me. But I'm curious to know that, finding the right book is literally like finding the right, like a best friend, right? And those kinds of books that we found as kids, we still have amazing affection for, right? So how do you help these children find those books that not necessarily may not even seem like the right book, right? But it ends up being that. How do you guide them? How does a program, or what message are you sending? It's teaching them to kind of find those books and bravely try things that they wouldn't normally try. How do you execute that? Because it's such a great, great plan.
I've never met a dark-hearted librarian. I don't know if they exist anymore. You know what I mean? It seems like they've all been pushed out of the business. Yeah. But okay, so far, I mean, we're still trying to figure this out. So far, the things that we've done is, number 1, we've put out these recommendation lists, and number 2 is we have had librarians, both public and school librarians, kind of pick up the baton. So for instance, about a month ago, I heard from a librarian at Live Oak School out in San Francisco, and what she did was she put up the 3 different ways to read outside of your walls up on a display in her library. And then she encouraged kids to go and find books that were like that. She offered her help for them to find them. And then when you read a book that fit one of those 3 criteria, they would get a little sticker, they'd put their name on it, they put the title that they read, and then that would go up on that wall. And she sent me both a photo of that wall before she started the program and a photo of that wall at the end of the program. It was awesome. It was awesome. We're hoping to get more like that. So right now, I'm working with the Library of Congress to put together a packet of downloadable materials that'll get you started on that kind of stuff.
And how is social media playing a part in all of this? Because it seems to me that one of the great things about 2016 is that authors are now more accessible than I used to think when I was a kid that authors lived in castles with moats and they were all rich, right? and it turns out that's true. Have a great day. But there's access now that we don't normally get. We didn't used to get when I was growing up in the late 70s, early 80s. The idea of being able to write Jason a note would seem literally like writing a note to a god, right? Because authors were these sort of, in my opinion, these kind of vaulted people. But how is social media playing a part in terms of accessibility and spreading the message? Are you finding that there's a lot of traffic and a lot of interest in that realm?
You should have totally sat here.
This is just going to keep happening? Okay, so right now we're still trying to figure it out. So right now I have 3 different things that I'm doing online. Number 1 is I'm doing a video podcast where I talk to people about books that affected them as kids. Number 2 is I'm doing a monthly blog with panels.net about making comics. And 3 is I'm doing a monthly blog with Reading Rainbow about reading books, about books that I've been reading in the past month. So those are some ways that we're trying to get the word out. I do think that in terms of diversity, online online platforms, social media has been really, really interesting. There has been this, I'm sure you've all noticed this, but there's been this long, sustained conversation online about diversity. One of the things that came out of that is a group called We Need Diverse Books. I think all 3 of us are on, we're all part of that, right? Okay. And I think, I'm interested in seeing how things go. I do think that We Need Diverse Books as an organization has been trying to find its feet. We're still trying to figure out what it means to be online, what sort of conversations are most productive, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, social media is that tricky thing where it can be very challenging to have a nuanced conversation in 140 characters, and at the same time, there's a young, great Black writer. She's 16 and she goes to school in Long Island. Her name's Cameron Garrett, and I follow her on social media because she interviewed me for HuffPo or one of those things. And she's so bright, and I read things and I recognize the world a bit more through her eyes. And so social media can give the voice to people who previously were voiceless. But it can also be abused so easily, and it can be abusive so easily in terms of the trolls coming out to say things at you, particularly in this charged political landscape in every sense. Social media is also really bad for selling things, tweets about the sale of your book. They just don't get the meta. People aren't there to be sold. They're there to have a conversation. So I always try to think of social media as a way of sort of expanding the sort of behind the curtain of what it's like to be an author, and that's fun to hear from fans in that way and readers. But social media can be dicey, can be tricky.
Do you guys have personal rules that you follow? What are your personal rules?
And I would love to talk offline about. I feel like we have so much to talk about.
What's said in the room stays in the room.
Which is not true. Which is not true because they're all tweeting right now. It's not true. Here's the thing. I think that social media is a really, really, really. I agree. It's dicey. It's powerful in that it can galvanize, right? It can galvanize digitally, at least. And it can create awareness in a way that we could not do 10 years ago. So now, whereas an issue will exist within a vacuum, now that issue can exist around the world. And that's powerful. And now books can, and the idea of a book can exist around the world, right? You can get people who are in Pakistan being like, hey, I read Aisha Saeed and I love this book, and they're in Pakistan, right? That's an incredible sort of thing. The issue, though, for me at least, as somebody who considers himself a professional, right, is that I have to be careful because there are a lot of people who follow me who are 14. And even though I am a human being and it's my personal thing, there are 14-year-olds who are following me that I choose, right? I'm not obligated, but that I choose to feel responsible for, right? I've chosen that, right? And so I'm always very careful about how I conduct myself online. The other thing is that, and this is what I want to talk to you about, but the other thing is that every single thing that is said remains. So as we try to find our way when it comes to advocacy programs and all of the things that we are trying to develop to bring light to certain topics, even topics that can cause emotional charge, what we can never forget is that every single thing we type is going to exist forever. So as we grow legs in some of our advocacy departments, as we grow legs, the history of our timeline, our through line, our thread doesn't go away and can ultimately be used against you when it comes to funding, when it comes to credibility, when it comes to all of these things, especially in a time where people are looking for things to discredit you. So that's sort of where I am. I'm always, if I got a problem with you, specifically as my writer friends or writer colleagues, and you put out a book, first of all, it's not my job to police you, first and foremost. My job is not to police you. My job is to promote the people that aren't getting promoted. That's what I'm here for. I'm not here to police the people who are writing trash, right? Problematic work, right? That's not my job, right? Because I'm not here to censor you. If I have an issue with you and I know you, I'll just call you. And we'll have that conversation between us. I don't ever feel a need to, like, we can call people in instead of calling people out. You know, we can have that conversation offline. That way, when it's over, you and I have had a human moment. Instead of me posting something and then causing a pile on. People are waiting to pile on. It's easy, right? I'm hidden behind an avatar. You'll never see me. And I think these are some of the issues that I think it presents that I hope that we are sort of constantly mitigating. Because I think that it can be ultimately in the long run, it can be damaging to the mission of all of our missions in terms of like producing and doing things like that. But we're all human as well, and there are personal platforms. But you're not just Gene, right? And you're not just Tim anymore. To the millions of 14-year-olds who love what you do, which is true. I don't know.
Can you guys talk a bit about your early influences and your relationship to that work and how powerful it was? Who were your guys? Who were your writers, guys and girls growing up? Who were the big influences for you?
I didn't read any books, so no readers, no books for me. All of my influences were rappers, and because they were the YA authors of our generation, like it or not. For subsets of us, right? For specific cultures and subsets in our country. For me, I looked to Public Enemy and NWA and Tupac, and that's who I was looking at. I mean, Straight Outta Compton, which some of you may have seen. Straight Outta Compton, it's the highest grossing biopic in history, and the reason why is because the people who went to see it are the people who were raised, right? The people who they raised, right? Those were the people who were telling our stories. Hamilton is one of the highest grossing plays in Broadway history for the same reason, right? And so I think we often discredit the literature of hip hop because it's poetry, and it is very poetic, and it's very complicated. And so that's what I look to. I was a kid who went to the store and bought a Queen Latifah album. That was my first album. I bought a Queen Latifah cassette tape, and I went home and I listened to it. And back in the day, I'm sure all of you in the room, most of you in the room at least, remember they all came with liner notes, and I read all the lyrics, and I rapped along, and then I read the lyrics without the music, and then I discovered poetry, right? And it was like, oh, Queen Latifah's doing the same thing that, Maya Angelou's doing, just sounds a little different. Right? Oh, Tupac is sort of spinning tales in the way that Shakespeare does, right? Sounds a little different, but shouldn't be discredited. And so that was sort of my way in. There was no books until I was 17, and then it was Richard Wright. But until then, I just listened to music. I just read lyrics.
Yeah, I probably read like 5% more than you did. I was a very bad student, in part because I just had my head in the clouds to get to New York and dance. But I mean, my short list of authors at the time was Shel Silverstein, Beverly Cleary, Roald Dahl. These were like the sweet spot authors for me. The book Matilda I read a million times and the cover fell off. But like Jason, I was like really influenced by musicals. I before we moved to Pittsburgh, I grew up down on the peninsula, and my parents took me and my older brother to see Cats at like the Golden Gate Theater, the tour in the late '80s, and these shows, of all things, that Cats is like my origin story, is sort of scary, and I should explore in therapy. But But like, I was like, oh my gosh, that's a job. They're getting paid to wear those costumes. And so for me, it was about, realizing that storytelling can take so many different forms, and you can be influenced in so many different ways. So for me, that was my big influence.
So maybe the theme of this question is that you don't have to be an awesome reader as a kid in order to be a published author as an adult. Because I was a very slow reader as a kid. I'm still an astoundingly slow reader. I read so slowly. I've like tried to look at YouTube videos on how to read faster, and it just doesn't work on my brain for some reason. As a kid, I did do a little bit of reading. I did like Lloyd Alexander a lot. He has this book of 3 series that I thought was amazing and mind-blowing. I loved Beverly Cleary. The first book that was assigned to me at school that I finished because I wanted to, but not because I had to, was Black Boy by Richard Wright. Was it really?
17 and a half years?
Yeah, it was, and then I ended up doing my senior thesis on Native Son.
It changed my whole life.
So he was, that book definitely changed the way I thought about, that book changed the way about how I thought about telling my own life story or thinking of my life as a story, for sure. And there's like a rootedness in his writer's voice that I still think about all the time. Most of my influence are definitely comic book people. So when I was a kid, I read a lot of superhero comics. There was a guy named Peter David who was writing the Hulk when I was in high school, and I thought he was amazing. So the Hulk, when I was really little, was just this really stupid character. He's this big green guy who's kind of dumb, always says Hulk smash, and then he like breaks tanks and stuff, and that's it. Peter David, his innovation was he had Hulk's power rooted not just in gamma rays, but in his psychological brokenness that was a result of his relationship with his dad. And like, that sounds stupid when I say it out loud, but when I was a kid, I thought it was amazing. I read those books, especially like Hulk number 377 it was mind blowing to me. Mind blowing. I can still picture the cover. I can still picture the page where they revealed that it was all about him and his dad. It was amazing. And then I was really into Jeff Smith, who does Bone. I love Linda Barry. One of her books, 100 Demons, I think is an absolute classic. I was really into, like, when I got into college, I got really into Osamu Tezuka, who's the creator of Astro Boy. But he did this book called Adolf, which is a graphic novel series set in World War II, and it's all about this Japanese reporter who figures out that Hitler was actually a Jew. Like, he finds these family documents about how Hitler's actually a Jew. That's not true, but in the story, it's amazing.
That reminds me too. I was like a religious Garfield reader, and one of the things one of the things that I hear a lot of booksellers say or even librarians, booksellers, is that they'll see their kid like run up to his mom and say, "I want to get this Captain Underpants book," and the mom will sort of say, "No, let's get you a real book." And I think one of the things that we all feel is just like, kids reading is reading. Whatever they want to read. If they self-identify as a reader, let them read whatever they want to read. It's a big feeler.
I want to open up the floor for questions. So if you have any questions for our authors, now is a good time. Yes?
Gene, you keep using the word comic and then graphic novel. Are they interchangeable, or is there a difference?
Yeah. So this is the urban legend about how the term graphic novel came about. In the 1970s, there was this guy named Will Eisner. He was one of the most influential cartoonists in the history of American cartooning. He had this book called Contract with God, which was it was basically a collection of short stories about these Jewish kids growing up in New York. No superpowers, no funny animals, no talking ducks, just straight up realistic fiction, right? And he calls up all these publishers saying, "I have this comic book about these Jewish kids in New York. Would you like to publish it?" And all of them said no. And then he called up those same publishers and he said, "I have this graphic novel about these Jewish kids growing up in New York. Would you like to publish it?" And he was able to land a publisher. So from the beginning, the term graphic novel has been a way for cartoonists to separate comic books from the term comic book and all of the history and the genre constraints that come with that term. So in my mind, like I think of them as interchangeable. When I talk to other cartoonists about what we do, we usually say comic book. When I talk to like booksellers and librarians, I usually say graphic novel.
Yes, right here.
My question is for Jane or anyone who has a history in teaching. Did you find it at all challenging to leave the classroom where you have that kind of like different dynamic with students or children and a different kind of influence? Is it hard to leave that?
It was so hard to leave. I just left last year. I left almost exactly 1 year ago. You know, I tried to hang on to teaching for so long. My very last year, I only had one class. And then it got to the point where I was traveling so much that every month I would end up missing like 2 or 3 days. And it just got too hard. When I made the decision to leave that school, it felt like I was breaking up with somebody. Like I lost sleep over it. I couldn't eat for 2 days. It was crazy. And even now, I think I still miss it. I do think that when things slow down a little bit, I do want to get back into education in some way, in a more, like in a deeper way. Yeah.
I would say I wasn't a formally trained teacher. I actually didn't go to college at all. But the reason I wrote Better Nate Than Ever because I was I worked on the choreographic staff of Billy Elliot on Broadway, and I was training all the kids in the show, including we got a kid named JP from Half Moon Bay who did the national tour, and we found him when I was on that staff in San Francisco. And so the reason I started writing for kids is because I was in the room with them so much and recognized that particularly middle schoolers kind of like get every joke, but they're not yet jaded, and so there's such a fun audience, and you can still really change a middle schooler's life in a way that's so often like writing for adults. I'm like less. People sometimes say like, "Do you want to write an adult book someday, a real book?" And I'm kind of like, no. I mean, maybe someday, but it's actually so much more fun to write for an audience whose life can still be changed. Not that adults can't be, but kids aren't stuck the way so many adults tend to be as they get older. So I do miss being kind of in the room with the kids because they keep you so honest and you get such an ear for the way they think and worry and talk. So are you a teacher? Yeah, I figured.
I don't miss it. I was a teacher too. I was a teacher. Nah, don't miss it. I don't miss it. I taught a year middle school language arts, and I taught a year in high school, senior English, and I was cool with it. I'm good. It is, but I also, you know what, English. But you know, the way I was teaching English was so much fun because I was just using like Kanye West lyrics and like I was sort of trying to figure out other ways to make it work. I think the issue for me is bureaucracy. I can't deal with the bureaucracy of school. Like being a teacher, the students are the easy part. I can't deal with all of the red tape and lesson plans, and man, that's crazy. They make it so hard to do your job, right? So I don't miss it. I miss the kids, but I don't miss, and I still get to engage with them through this, you know, without the restraints. I get to make a mess of the classroom and then leave, you know, drop a bomb and then be like, now your teacher has to clean up this mess that I've created since I've told you that you don't have to listen to nobody, right? Have a good day, everybody, you know.
What advice do you have for writers who want to write more diverse books?
Who want to write more diverse books?
Who wants to write more diverse books? But you I'm just saying, like, this is like a black hole.
I do think, okay, so this is the other question that gets debated online a lot, right? And that is, like, do you have to be an Asian American in order to write an Asian American protagonist, or do you have to be gay in order to write a gay protagonist? And I think, I think it's really tricky. I think so. I'm going to answer this question as somebody who teaches writers through Hamlin University. You know, like when I look at my students, I see so much fear between them and the finished novel that I am loath to add any more fear onto that, right? And I recognize that fear that they're feeling, I feel. So I never want to say you are not allowed to write this story or you are not allowed to write that story, because I feel like that just adds to that layer of fear. So what I tell them is, if they want to write somebody who has a different identity than they do, has a different life experience that they do, that they just have to be prepared to do a lot of homework. They shouldn't be afraid of making mistakes in that first draft, but make sure that you take the feedback on that first draft, especially for issues of identity, very seriously, and make sure that that leads you to doing homework. I think that the question for publishers is very different from the questions for the individual writer. I think publishers, especially if you're working in like high-profile pop culture spaces, I think you have a certain kind of responsibility, right? So for instance, Wonder Woman wasn't written, the Wonder Woman monthly series was not written by a regular woman writer until the early 2000s. That is just nuts. That's crazy, right? That's like crazy talk. Shang-Chi, who's the most prominent Asian character in the Marvel universe, so far has not had an Asian or Asian American writer as the lead. So those, I just think that those are two very different questions.
I mean, I think, so here's the thing, because this question comes up a lot. I also am an MFA, low-res teacher at Leslie, which is a better program than Hamlin. And so if you all are interested, no, I'm kidding. Gene's at Hamlin, clearly it's okay. But I think it's interesting because I'm in the same space, right, where my students are like, everyone's shook, And I think that this is also where social media has played a tremendous role in sort of creating this interesting insecurity in writers, for better or for worse. But here's the thing. One, I'm never going to tell you what you can and can't write, period. Nobody can. I don't care how much heat, how much controversy. No one can tell you what you can and cannot write. It is your art. It is your work. You just have to know what that means, right? And I agree with Gene with that. Look, if you were going to write a novel about a civil engineer, or about the antebellum South, right? You would spend 6 months, you would be Laurie Halls Anderson and spend a year in Charleston doing all the research to make sure you got the historical facts of that time period correct. So why is it that when writing culture, we don't do the same? We don't give the same due diligence, right? We use history and things that seem to be anomalies to our lives, professional-wise, as reasons to research. But when it comes to culture, we don't give it the same credence, and you should, right? Like none of us have been I haven't been to Vietnam, right? Chris Lynch wasn't in Vietnam, but he wrote some of the best Vietnam War books, right? He wasn't in the Vietnam War, but his books are incredible, and they all seem so real, right? Because he spent all this time researching it. So I just think you have, like Gene said, you just got to do your due diligence, get it vetted. Find people to read it. Ask the hard questions. Take the criticism. Know that you will mess up. You are going to blow this, right? The first time, and maybe even the second draft, and maybe even the third, all right? But that's something that you have to know going into it. And I just don't want people to be scared. And I want people to be okay with knowing that, like, when the book hits the shelf, people are still going to find fault. It's going to, right? And I think we have there's a strange idyllic world in our industry and in our genre where like people are expecting these perfect books. And I think that like writing books it's a process, and there are a lot of layers to us all. We all are complex. There are all kinds of privileges that all of us have. And I think that there's no way for you to write a book void of those privileges. And I think that it's tricky because they're always going to show themselves. And when they do, instead of there being some critical analysis and some sort of like some actual human connectivity, we just sort of like lash out. And so then you just stop writing instead of writing a better book next time. And so all of these things I think are things that we should be considering. But write your book. It's all good.
Other questions? Anything? Yes, over here.
Because many of you have written for middle grade audiences and also YA, I'm just wondering, is an idea, when an idea comes to you, does it present itself as one or another? Is it dictated by the subject matter, by the character?
If you didn't hear the questions about straddling middle grade writing and also young adult writing, sometimes it's just practical. Like Jason talked about this at another panel, but my first book that I sold was for middle schoolers, and so Simon & Schuster encouraged me to stay in that lane for at least a moment so that you could sort of help build upon that audience. So sometimes it's a practical choice, and sometimes you're absolutely right. The sort of subject dictates what you're going to write about. When I wanted to write The Great American Whatever, I wanted to write with a more mature voice, and I wanted to write to the people who had written to me and said, I know Better Late Than Ever wasn't for me, but I'm a theater kid, so I decided to read a book that looked too young for me, and I loved it. So sometimes it's a practical choice just about who you write to. Ultimately, you might, Raina Tagelmeyer, extraordinary graphic novelist who basically owns half the New York Times list at any moment. She, as she should, when she first conceived of drama, for instance, if you look back at some of her early work, all the characters are like 5 years older. And it was her publisher who said to her, we actually think this is going to play better to the middle school audience. So it's a real sort of brackish mix of reasons why you might write to one group or another. It's...
And just how many... I always want to do it, but the kids, they mess me up, man. It just also is about how many, like, you can't. Just say it, dude. You know, it's just interesting because I write these characters and we're writing our books, and I'm such a 16-year-old at heart, and I'm like, God, man, there's so many great, like, really inappropriate jokes I could put in this book or not, right? So if this character is like 10 years old, then like all of my like big jokes I can't put in this book, and so then they gear it toward middle grade, right? And so some of it has to do with like all of that kind of stuff as well, like just things. Some of it has to literally do with here's what you can and can't do, right? If you say this character is 10. Here's a list of the things you can't say, right? And which is always complicated for me, at least, because I'm always like, what? I got a little brother. He's crazy. He talks crazy, you know? Like, oh, I've been in these schools when I've been cursed out by an 11-year-old, right? So I know that this is fine. You know, like, it's not fine. The parents are gonna have our heads, and so there are also like those things that I personally also take into consideration. Like, do I want the book? Do I want to hold on to my F-bombs, or do I want the book to exist in the world? You know.
Basically, you want Scholastic Book Fair to take your book.
Exactly. Maybe 11th grade will publish anything. You can say anything.
Now, these 4 authors will be signing their books outside, but I want to say thank you to all of you, and thank you to all of you for coming for a great session.